Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. I am thrilled to have you joining me for today's conversation. Today, we're talking about dysgraphia. For those of you who may not know about dysgraphia, it impacts written expression, so writing, fine motor abilities, and it makes writing a slow and often very frustrating process for children and adults alike. It's a challenge that doesn't exist in isolation. And so it can co-occur and frequently co-occurs with ADHD and dyslexia and other learning differences. Joining me today to talk about dysgraphia is Natasha Gray. She is the founder of Spark Learning, which is widely recognized as the Caribbean's authority on learning disabilities and disorders. Natasha brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in supporting children and families navigating learning challenges. So happy to have her here with me today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Welcome, Natasha.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for inviting me to your podcast.
I'm so glad to have you here. I've been following you on Instagram for so long and so impressed with all of the information that you share that is so helpful to so many parents trying to navigate differences in learning disabilities, neurodivergence. And it's such important information that you share and so helpful to parents. So thank you for all that you are doing.
Thank you as well.
And I'm really excited that you said yes to coming and talking about dysgraphia. We've talked about dyslexia on the podcast. We've talked about dyscalculia on the podcast. We have not really jumped into dysgraphia, even though we've kind of touched on it in other episodes. And again, because you work in this space, working with students who struggle with learning and providing those important interventions and increasing understanding for families, I thought, again, I wanted to have you on the podcast to talk about this topic. So thank you for saying yes. And I'm excited to jump into this topic, maybe even starting with the basics about what dysgraphia is, and then we can go from there.
Well, dysgraphia is a neurodevelopmental learning difficulty, learning disability, learning difference,
Yes.
So children with dysgraphia, they tend to avoid writing, right? And they often complain about their hands hurting and their fingers are cramping, and they tend to write very slowly. Their written expression, they cannot get their thoughts fully down. They have all the ideas in their head, but sometimes they find difficulty getting their thoughts down on paper. But as I was saying, dysgraphia ranges from mild to severe, and every child is different. And there are different types of dysgraphia. So each child may present differently. So it's important that, parents and teachers are able to identify when a child might be struggling with their writing and, look further and see if they have dysgraphia.
Right. And I'm so glad you mentioned that there are different types of dysgraphia, because that's very similar to what I've noticed as my work as a neuropsychologist, is that dysgraphia can present differently in different individuals. And so, one of the things that parents will say is that, my child has all these great ideas, is very verbose, talks at length, but then when they have to write something down, they write as little as possible. You'll see, write an essay and there are 2 sentences on the paper. And so I'd love for you to talk about the different types of dysgraphia that have been identified. And then we can go, again, talk more about intervention and what comes next when educators and parents see this.
Well, I like to talk about the dyslexic type dysgraphia first, because that's the most common that we see. And children with the dyslexic type dysgraphia, they have poor spelling, first off. They mix their letters up. They jumble their words up. Sometimes they copy well. That's one interesting thing. They copy information very well, but they struggle with the spelling. They struggle with their handwriting. Sometimes their handwriting may fall off the page. It's not online. And I mean, that's talking about another type of dysgraphia. But as the dyslexic type dysgraphia, they struggle with reading and getting the words correctly spelled on paper. And as you mentioned, getting those brilliant thoughts on paper. They have these, words that they would like to use, enormous. They can articulate what they want to say well, but when it comes to writing, that enormous word becomes big, a simple word. And they tend to do that often. And they generally have poor handwriting, those who struggle with dyslexic type dysgraphia. And then there's the phonological type. With this type, these children struggle with the sounds of the letters. And that, because they struggle with the sounds, they're not able to write correctly the words or blend the words together. We call those small sounds phonemes. So because they're able to blend words together to form words, they struggle with the phonological aspect of writing. They not only do they struggle with writing it, but they struggle with what we call spacing, even and words together and getting those thoughts down on paper. Those with phonological dysgraphia, they struggle with non-words or irregular words as well. Those high frequency words that they never are able to spell simply because they sound differently. So the word like said will be SED instead of AID, because that's what they're hearing, and they do not understand the phonological aspect, the sound to symbol aspect of dysgraphia. And then there's the lexical type of dysgraphia. I usually talk about that one last, simply because it's the least common, but since I brought it up, find that adults, older children tend to struggle more with the lexical dysgraphia, simply because the phonological aspect, as I mentioned earlier, the phonological aspect, they did not grasp that as well. And as they went through school and they're in the workplace, then they're unable to write and spell words correctly. They misspell words a lot. Because they cannot see the mental picture of words. So as you get older, older persons, older children, adults, they tend to look at, so for example, the word like mat and sat, they're not able to compare the two and know that they sound the same, and may not write those simple words correctly. So it's really about having mental pictures and lexical type, but it occurs mainly in older children and adults, and you find that their spelling is phonetically correct, but just not correctly spelled. Their spelling is generally off.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I know that there are two other types that you mentioned. I think it's spatial and motor. Can you talk about those two types?
So the spatial type dysgraphia, children or adults, they tend not to stay online. So they write, and the writing comes off the line or off the page in some cases. They tend to not space their words out, and everything is very close and jumbled between words. Even slant, we observe slant. So you would find some children, they may have an awkward grip, spelling grip. They turn the page of the paper or the book in a completely different direction, and they write with an angle. And we find that with the slant, if they write with a slant throughout, we look at that, and that's also a type of spatial dysgraphia. Yeah. Yes. And then there's the motor type dysgraphia. That has everything to do with our fine motor skills. Every child, every person develops at different rates. And you may have a child in your classroom who may have very weak bone structure and may take a longer time for their fine motor skills to develop. Therefore, their hand muscles are weak, their dexterity, it's really hard for them to hold a pencil properly and that grip and write fluently and on the line. Even when they're copying from the board, it is difficult for them. And most children with dysgraphia, whichever type it is, they struggle from writing off the board. And in the Caribbean, it's also very harsh because teachers tend to erase the boards quickly, thinking that something may have written.
Everybody's gotten it down, right?
Yes. And because they take so long to write, they miss a lot of what they're meant to be learning, maybe perhaps even their homework. And I've had several instances where, teachers observe children struggling with their writing. And, it's also hard for teachers to try to implement certain strategies for them because some teachers may not know. But the 5 different types of dysgraphia teachers and parents can support their child who may have any of these types of dysgraphias. And I think it's really important that teachers know that children who struggle with dysgraphia, they also have difficulties with processing information, speed. They're unable, like I said earlier, to get those thoughts down on paper quickly enough, and as well as their working memory, getting all of that information down on paper really, allows them to just struggle.
Yes, absolutely. And, as you're describing the different types and you're talking about difficulties with phonological processing and the dyslexic type, and even the lexical type and the spatial type, you can see that there are going to be a lot of co-occurring struggles, right? That's why dyslexia frequently co-occurs with dysgraphia, because if you can't hear the sound symbol associations and understand it, then how can you then apply it in your written work, right?
Absolutely. Yes, they are comorbid, and quite a few children who have dyslexia have dysgraphia. They struggle with understanding the sounds and writing them down on paper.
Yes. And for parents or educators who might be listening, I'm just thinking mostly of parents who might see their kids struggling with writing, or, may have not even thought that this could be a dysgraphia. Are there red flag signs that you see that parents often report that suggests to you that this could be dysgraphia? I know illegible handwriting is one.
That's like the first. I always say they avoid writing. That's to me the first. They're like, they may have a legible handwriting, but they actually do not want to write. And they in the classroom, they will find escape routes. They may want to leave the classroom, go to the bathroom for a reason. But for parents and teachers, especially in the classroom, because that's where a lot of the writing occurs. I tell parents and teachers, when you see a child struggling, it's really important to at least let them know, okay, I understand that you're struggling, first of all, because teachers tend to think that all children are going to write at the same pace, and they don't. So one of the things I often tell teachers is, if you can type out what you're going to write, yes, I know it seems as if it's like you're doing extra work, but if you can type it out for that child and print it and share it with all the children in the classroom or the parents, it will be helpful, because often I get parents complain that the child wasn't able to complete the writing task or the homework, and then they come with no homework and it's an issue. I tell teachers to be very patient. And if you suspect that a child is struggling, ask the parents, call the parents in and have a conversation with them. And occupational therapists are absolutely the persons they should be seeing. The type of therapy that an occupational therapist will provide for a child who's struggling with dysgraphia would definitely help them in the classroom setting, because they do use different type of strategies to support the fine motor development.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, again, connecting them with the appropriate intervention is key, especially given the different types of dysgraphia. Obviously, if there's a motor issue, then we want to address that motor system in therapy. And oftentimes parents might not know what type it is because they might see the avoidance, but not know why. They might see the illegible handwriting, that inconsistent letter spacing. And you talked initially about fatigue. They get very tired, when they start writing, they start it, but they can't persist with the written task.
Yes, and it's evident. You find that they erase a lot. They erase words quite often. They even they press hard, and those are things that we look at when we're trying to understand their writing. How quickly, their handwriting speed, where is it at? But you notice those pressing hard. You see that the pencil is, they're really struggling. They're pressing hard, and it is painful. And they do complain about their hands hurting. But pencil grip as well causes them to have such pain because with the fingers and the hands, if they're not holding that pencil correctly, then it will cause aspects of their hand and fingers to hurt. So, yes. So we often try to practice early with the younger kids with cutting, using rubber bands to stretch their fingers and using squishy things to develop that fine motor skills.
Yes. And once parents and educators suspect dysgraphia, and parents suspect dysgraphia, often the question is, what do I do now? And you mentioned occupational therapy, particularly to address the fine motor and the dexterity component. Are there other things that can be done to support students, for example, with the other types of dysgraphia? Because that's one of the things that parents will ask is, what do I do? What can help my child?
Well, I often, with children, letter formation, a lot of young children, they weren't taught to correctly form their letters. So I often, there's it's a little printout with how you correctly write your letters. And I start there. That's the very first thing. And keep practicing and watch them as they start to blend words together and, try not to give them too many big words, especially if they're younger children. And that happens often in primary setting. Teachers tend to give children who may struggle with dysgraphia words that are above them. And it's for them to write properly, they need to start with smaller sets of words. So forming your B's and your D's and all your letters correctly, and then learning to blend them together, especially those who struggle with the phonological aspect of dysgraphia. It's really the sound to spell and writing it correctly. Those who have motor dysgraphia, like I suggested earlier, doing a lot of hand strengthening techniques. You wouldn't believe it, but things like stretching and there are little exercises as well that we will do. And it does help. Pushing your hand against the wall and pushing your body and pressing your hands back. That helps a lot of children who have very weak dexterity and poor muscles. When it comes to spatial, we use spatial dysgraphia. We use little the sticks, the lollipop sticks, or we ask children to use their finger so they can space their words correctly. Yes, and those techniques, as simple as they seem, help children along the way. And I have young adults who still use those techniques. I have adults who are still using their strengthening balls to help because it really is important that those muscles, especially if they're very weak, to increase.
Yes, yes. And are there other techniques that help older students? And I know that you said that you also work with adults who have difficulty really expressing their ideas. We talked about those individuals who can have these conversations, in-depth conversations, but can't express themselves in the same way in their written work. Are there techniques and strategies that work for those individuals?
Well, what we tend to do with older adults and older children, we try not to trivialize or make it childish for them. So we tend to use what we call functional handwriting skills and the very basic things that they will be writing about. Filling out application forms, for example. We use things like application forms, bank forms, so they're familiar with some words and that they can easily fill out, like I said, application forms as well as medicine. They are able to write those things that they're familiar with are things that they use a lot. But with older children, we mainly work on their phonological aspect, and we use a multi-sensory way of introducing them into phonemes and phonics and phonological awareness skills. Even things, and it's surprising, even things like Play-Doh. I know it may seem a little, but older children do still find Play-Doh very, very helpful because they are able to form their letters and they're able to touch. And with writing, you want to be able to feel letters, feel how they feel. And we find that does help older children a lot. We also use typing. Instead of writing, you can type. We don't actually teach them how to type, but we tell them, it would be great if you can take a program with assistive technology using a computer to help you write. Speech to text to speech programs. Dragonfly is one of them. You can beat what you want and it will write for you. So we try to make it easier, especially for adults. They don't have all that time to write. And because they already struggle with writing, using text to speech to text devices does help them a lot. There are also, pens that they can use to read what words from a novel. Although it's reading, they still struggle with reading. Those who struggle with writing. So we try to introduce different techniques and strategies to help adults and older children grasp the writing skills.
Yes. And I think that the assistive technology tools that you mentioned really highlights the role of technology in helping a lot of these students to really demonstrate what it is that they know and what they want to say in a way that gets impacted when they have dysgraphia, when they can't express themselves the way they would like in written form. This gives them another avenue to do that.
Yes. And like I said earlier, a lot of people, because children articulate and adults articulate well, they're not seeing them writing. They're like, nothing is wrong until they actually see the writing skills and see how illegible their handwriting can be. It's at that point that, they realize there's an issue.
And that's why classroom accommodations are so important, because without the opportunity to use those tools and to get that extra time when you're writing slowly, again, you really aren't able to show educators and show others what you're really capable of and to reach your full potential while you're building those skills.
Yes, and even in examinations, like you mentioned, the accommodations, being able to have some extra time, or someone who's going to write for you, a scribe. That is so important because they have, like you said, they have the thoughts in their head, but they just struggle, and it's unfair that because they cannot get their thoughts quickly and on paper quickly enough, that they are penalized for writing. So the scribe in examination settings is really important.
Yes. And I always talk about the emotional toll that children and adolescents and adults experience when they struggle with reading, with writing, with other things that impact them in their daily lives. So academically, we're thinking about young people, but you mentioned filling out applications for adults and other ways of expressing themselves, right? And writing is such a fundamental part of school. And kids with dysgraphia may feel frustrated and even develop anxiety about writing tasks, which is why they avoid doing it. How can we support their emotional well-being while building their confidence?
Well, with older children, adults especially, I talk to them about their family relationships, because if they're struggling, and often they'll say, my child, I'm seeing the same symptoms with my child, my son or my daughter. And I go, well, yes, it is hereditary if you are struggling to an extent. But with older adults, we try to give them back their self-esteem, like challenging them to write short notes to their family members, write what they plan to do during the day, just short little things to help them increase their writing skills by doing some very simple things. When they're able to write a message to someone and the spelling is corrected, they're also able to, that helps them a lot. And it also increases their vocabulary. And I found that we would ask them to send a message to us, telling us about their day. It doesn't have to be too long, but what it does is allow them to see where their spelling might be corrected or it's incorrect spelling, but it gives them self-esteem to start sending messages, because they find sending messages, emails, very daunting. They do not like to talk. They do not like to do anything as it relates to writing or spelling or reading. So it's a whole mix of emotions that they go through, simply because they're unable to do the very basic thing, which is spell. And we have adults as well, and older children who have difficulty still spelling their name.
And I can see, that intervention working not only for adults, but for middle school students, for high school students. Again, it's about practicing those skills outside of the academic realm, right? Which will build those, like you said, those vocabulary skills, syntax skills, the organization of their writing, all of those things help them to practice. And I know a lot of educators also use journaling or even letter writing, write a letter to your grandmother or write a letter to another family member where there's low pressure.
Correct. Yes. And in the workplace as well. I have a couple of people who work professionally. They struggle with writing, but their saving grace is email and spell check. So in the workplace, a lot of employers actually don't know that their employees are struggling with dysgraphia, but simply because they're able to present their work in a way that it cannot be seen that they're struggling with some type of writing difficulty. So emails, like I said, and the spell checks and using a laptop really does help. But it's really important as well for employers to understand that there are adults who will be working for them who struggle with writing.
Right. And you're really highlighting kind of the long-term impact of dysgraphia, and also what happens when dysgraphia isn't identified early on and it persists into adulthood. And sometimes you're getting adults coming in for the first time saying, I've always had this issue. It's never been identified. And they're getting support from you or someone like you at a later stage. But, ideally, we would love to be able to identify these issues early on so that we can help children build those skills up early on and have better outcomes for their written work, for their vocabulary, for their language development, and for reading. Because, we always talk on this podcast about when you're younger, you're learning to read, but then from that point, from second grade and often first grade on, you're reading to learn. And it's a similar thing that happens with writing in terms of demonstrating what it is that you know. You go from spelling to actually writing to express your thoughts and ideas.
Yes, and that's absolutely true. Being identified from early and having early intervention, being screened, or just basic looking at how you're forming your letters, seeing how you're writing. Those are the type of checklists teachers and parents need to be in tune with so that they can identify whether their child or student is struggling with dysgraphia. Recently, I had a parent whose daughter, smart child, but she does have dysgraphia. And it was very upsetting for me because the teacher said the child, not only was she lazy, I wasn't able to write the notes off of the paper. But because she was unable to complete the task, the writing task, she told her she had to write 100 lines. This is in a WhatsApp message that the parents shared with me. And then in the same message, she said, you know what? I'm not going to give her 100. I'll give her 50. I'm just going to reduce it. And I thought, this child is actually struggling with writing and you're giving them lines. So it's important that teachers have an understanding and can empathize with children who may struggle with dysgraphia and not think that it's that they're lazy. It's really not because they're lazy, it's because they're struggling. And it could also be an issue of not even able to see clearly, So teachers need to be aware of the different types of dysgraphia and how they can support their children, support from early by identifying them and providing the right type of intervention and being patient.
Yes, I agree with all that you are saying, because having them write lines over and over again doesn't address the underlying issue. It doesn't address the underlying issue, which means that they can't build the skills that they need to in order to become better at that thing that is harder for them.
Yes, it indeed is.
Natasha, I cannot thank you enough for being with me, for sharing your expertise and sharing these strategies for parents and educators, and also just having a better understanding of what dysgraphia is, why it's a challenge, and the importance of getting the right support so children can overcome obstacles and reach their full potential. I mean, your insights have been so valuable, and I know that listeners are going to walk away feeling more informed and empowered. If our listeners want to get in touch with you, want to know more about your work, and I mean, you have a lot of information to share, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
You can reach me by DMing on Instagram and my WhatsApp numbers anytime.
Okay. And I will put all that information in the show notes.
I am not sure if we'll respond immediately, but we will respond as best as we can or as soon as we can, or by email. Yes.
Yes. And I will put a link to your Instagram account, which is incredible, Spark Learning, in the show notes, and encourage people to kind of check it out. And I know you have a link to your website on there too. So I hope that people will reach out to you, connect with you, because again, the information that you share, the work that you do is so important to so many learners. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Karen, for having me. And I'm blessed to know that I was able to share some information with you today.
Me too. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. If you found today's conversation helpful, be sure to share it. Don't keep it all to yourself. And don't forget to visit childnexus.com for more resources and information. Until next time, take care.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.